Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Qualcomm Showcase session. My name is Luigi. I'm Senior Director of Government Affairs at Qualcomm, and today we will focus on our showcase on millimeter wave. And we have two distinguished speakers. We have Jeanette Stewart from Analysis Mason. She's a partner at Analysis Mason. We have commissioned to Jeanette and Analysis Mason together with Ericsson a study on the economic benefits of millimeter wave deployments for Europe. And we will first in the showcase session listen to her and to the outcome. And then after Jeanette, we will have Tony Lavender. Tony Lavender is a partner at Plum Consulting. And Tony has been commissioned an additional study by Qualcomm and Nokia. And basically with this study, we are trying to see and get advice from Tony how to unlock the millimeter wave market in Europe. So without further ado, I would leave the floor to Jeanette. And if you have any questions, please save them until the end. You can post them in the chat, and then I will redirect them at the end of both presentations to Jeanette and to Tony. So Jeanette, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Luigi, and good day, everybody. Thank you very much for joining this session. I'm delighted to be talking to you today. My name is Jeanette Stewart from Analysis Mason, and I was the director for this study that we have recently completed for Qualcomm together with Ericsson. And the title of the study is Status, Costs and Benefits of 5G 26 GHz Deployment in Europe. If we could move on to the next slide, please. The study was published in May 2021. We started working on the study earlier in 2021. The study is published and available on Analysis Mason's website if anybody would like to download the study after this conference. The study was to cover the status, costs and benefits of 5G millimeter wave deployment in Europe. I'm sure as many in the audience will be aware, Europe's main millimeter wave band for 5G deployment is in 26 gigahertz band. So that was the band that we were focusing on. We focused on modeling costs and benefits per European country. We covered 30 European markets in total, so that includes the EU 27 countries, Norway, Switzerland, and the UK. We used several inputs to the study. We conducted our own secondary research, looking at published announcements made by industry players on 26 gigahertz developments. We obviously spoke extensively to our two clients, Qualcomm and Ericsson, for their inputs. We used our own analysis as well. We built up a model of deployment costs of using 26 gigahertz on top of other mobile bands in a mobile deployment, and we also built a model looking at the benefits that 26 gigahertz deployment might bring to specific use cases, which I will describe in a moment. One interesting area of the study was that we also conducted a series of interviews with several mobile and fixed network operators, not just in Europe, but in several other markets internationally. And the intention of the primary research was to discuss several questions with operators, such as the services that might use millimeter wave spectrum, the types of deployment, the bandwidth requirements, and what operators consider to be the particular benefits of using millimeter wave, as well as other spectrum that those operators had available. So if we go on to the next slide, please. A summary of our key points is shown on the slide here, and I will present these in further detail. We found from our own research, together with what we were hearing from the operator interviews, that millimeter wave is generally viewed as a complement to mid-band spectrum in a very wide range of 5G use cases, an increasingly diverse range, in fact, which I will describe in this presentation. And this sort of, I think, reinforces the priority of getting millimeter wave spectrum into the market in Europe, if not already available. We also looked at the status of millimeter wave licensing in Europe, and I will also describe that shortly. The modeling suggested significant absolute benefits of deploying 26 gigahertz in mobile networks and for mobile use cases. We compared benefits to the cost of deployment, and I will describe that as well in the presentation. Overall, the net benefit was positive. Our primary research also suggested that network operators expected to use mmWave to address a variety of use cases, which would include enhanced mobile broadband in high footfall areas, high density urban and suburban locations, stadiums and large venues, so things like immersive content, but also there's a wide variety of other types of deployment, including smart factories, including deployments in ports, airports, and other specific locations as well. If we move on to the next slide, please. So we found from our research that 26 gigahertz deployment enables both expansion of existing use cases within 5G networks, as well as potentially new use cases as well. Where capacity is required in 5G networks, we found that the additional capacity that 26 gigahertz offers will be particularly useful. There are obviously several applications of 5G where very high speed and capacity and latency are particularly important. So things like gaming, augmented reality and virtual reality experiences, immersive content, etc. And there is a growing range of applications for those kind of uses: tourism, retail, just generally in city centres, transport, leisure, etc. One use case which I'm sure many in the audience will be already familiar with is 5G fixed wireless access and sort of the whole FMC environment. Generally in Europe, use of 26 gigahertz together with 3.5 gigahertz or potentially standalone can deliver high-speed wireless broadband both to homes and offices. There's also a range of use cases at specific locations where the user might have specific connectivity needs. And the potential for local optimization of uplink and downlink capacity using 26 gigahertz was highlighted as one of the particularly interesting uses of this spectrum. If we go on to the next slide, please. Just in terms of the status of licensing, this is clearly a fast-moving area, but at the point of conducting this study, we were observing that licensing of 26 gigahertz has been slower than for other 5G frequency bands. So in Europe, the other key bands, of course, are 3.5 gigahertz or mid-band spectrum, and also low band in 700 megahertz. So this slide shows a map of the status of 26 gigahertz awards at the time of producing our report. Since the study was completed, there have been several other developments, such as 5G Spectrum Award confirmation in Croatia and also in North Macedonia. If we go on to the next slide, please. So our modelling considers a mixture of architectures for mmWave deployment, and we use these deployment architectures to calculate both costs and benefits of the deployment. Generally, this is building on top of a base case of assumed 5G mobile broadband network deployment in each of the markets that we have modelled. We've specifically focused the mmWave deployment on several use cases that included high capacity urban suburban locations, fixed wireless access, industrial and enterprise use cases in particular. For each of those use cases, we model a mix of architectures. So we have assumed that some of these use cases might be delivered using macro site coverage. So we would assume 3.5 gigahertz or mid-band coverage, and then that macro site would be upgraded with 26 gigahertz radio. The alternative would be to use a new 26 gigahertz dedicated radio site. Now that dedicated radio site might share 3.5 gigahertz capacity from a nearby macro site. Another alternative is a 26 gigahertz small cell, which could be deployed either outdoors or indoors to meet specific capacity and capability requirements, for example, in industrial sites. If we go on to the next slide, please. So for each of the use cases modelled, we estimated a benefit to cost ratio. Generally, that ratio is between around about 5 and 20, as shown on the slide here. The smart factories use case gave us the largest absolute benefit, and this is at the European level, so this is across the 30 markets that we modelled. And as you can see on the slide there, what we found for the smart factories use case was that the total benefit is 76 billion euros, and that's relative to a 14 billion euro investment in the 26 gigahertz architectures that I described on the previous slide. So this excludes the rollout of MmWave networks in each European country. So this is the cost of deploying the architectures using mmWave. While the smart factories has the largest absolute benefit, you can see from the slide here that some of the cost benefit ratios are actually higher for some of the other use cases shown here. So for example, ports, airports, and fixed wireless access. If we move on to the next slide, I mentioned in the introduction that we did use primary research to inform our analysis in this project, and we wanted to speak to stakeholders for several reasons, just to understand the types of deployment, the types of architecture, to validate our assumptions on use cases, and also to validate the modelling assumptions that we used in the cost-benefit model. So we found there was good consistency amongst the operators that we spoke to in terms of the sorts of deployments that operators were considering, and these have all featured in our modelling. So MmWave in high capacity locations, 5G based FWA, industrial applications, sort of street hub kiosks in city centres, and other venue specific coverage. If we go on to the next slide, please. One interesting point that stakeholders raised, we asked, what do you think the particular benefits of 26 gigahertz might be over and above other spectrum that is used for 5G? And one of the points raised was that the capability for very high capacity and also flexible deployment potentially exists in 26 gigahertz. And this might enable, for example, local variations in traffic profiles to be better accommodated. So as I'm sure many will be aware in this audience, with 5G use cases being extremely diverse, there will be some use cases where there is very heavy traffic in the downlink direction, and there are other use cases where it is the opposite and traffic is predominantly uplink focused. Obviously, in nationwide mobile networks, the operator will dimension the capacity to meet that consumer requirement nationally. There is some more limited flexibility in a nationwide network to have local variations. So it's potentially interesting to be able to overlay this 26 gigahertz deployment and better reflect those local traffic variations. If we go on to the next slide, please. So just wrapping up before I move on and allow Tony to give his presentation. What we're finding is that the 26 gigahertz ecosystem is developing rapidly. I think even since our study has completed, there are several new developments. Multiple networks have now started to be deployed globally, and in European markets, although the process of licensing has been slower, there are a growing number of announcements now of mmWave deployments starting to happen in Europe. Further European licensing is obviously very important to build that ecosystem, and this was something that was commented on by the operators that we spoke to in the study, that as further licensing takes place and further deployments occur, then this helps to build the both the network and the device ecosystem to the benefit of all. Finally, just to note that 26 gigahertz is not just a European 5G band. There is a number of other markets worldwide where spectrum is being made available in this band. So shown on the slide here, for example, we've got Australia, Chile, Hong Kong, Thailand, UAE, etc. So a number where either 26 or 28 gigahertz spectrum is being made available, and of course within the 3GPP band plan there is the overlap between those two bands. So that summarizes my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. Luigi, I will hand back to you to introduce Tony.
And thank you, Jeanette. It's a very interesting presentation. So let's move to Tony now. And Tony, as I said before, is a partner at Plan Consulting, and he will tell us a little bit more about the study that was commissioned to Plan from Nokia and Qualcomm. So Tony, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Luigi, and thank you, Jeanette, as well. So I'm going to talk about a study that we did. I can't see my slides at the moment, actually, but I'll carry on demand for 26 gigahertz spectrum in Europe. And next slide, please. And what we've addressed in this study is what has happened, what achievements there have been with millimeter wave so far, deployment status and some key drivers and inhibitors, the mechanisms for access to spectrum and their effectiveness for a range of use cases, and some issues around the consistency of the approach on the award to spectrum. And three things we've focused on specifically in the study because they really form the basis of the business case for people who want to deploy 26. Our use cases, the ecosystem, and access to spectrum. So next slide, please. I won't spend too much time on this because I'm sure many people in the audience know this, but what I've set out on this slide is the way in which 5G spectrum in Europe has been conceived with low band, mid band and high band, and also the instruments which are in place like the EECC in terms of bringing that spectrum to market. The other thing I just want to very quickly mention here is the Commission's Connectivity Toolbox, which has presented some best practices to encourage investment in high capacity, very high capacity networks. And I think the key point to take away from this slide is that much of the formal legislation and regulation which is required to allow 26 gigahertz to come to market is there, and that really delays to deployment now effectively delay the benefits that use of the spectrum can deliver. So next slide, please. Talking about 5G in general, and the chart shown on this slide comes from the GSA for April 2021. 5G is developing fast. And as you can see on the right-hand side there, there's 162 operators that have launched 5G networks in 68 countries. You got 453 operators at that time investing in networks in the form of test trials, pilots, planned or actual deployments. And another important thing is you got 68 operators in 38 countries who are investing in 5G public standalone networks. Now, this picture here is for 5G overall. And on the next slide, please. For millimeter wave deployment, you've got a growing number of operators. So again, at the same date, 106 operators in 20 countries holding public licenses, many of which are regional for the operation of millimeter wave systems. You got 24 operators in 15 countries, and in particular the USA, who are already deploying 5G networks using millimeter wave spectrum. Excuse me. And you've got 19 countries that have announced formal dates, another 19 countries that have announced formal dates with plans for assigning frequencies between above 24 gigahertz between now and the end of 2022. So next slide, please. So use cases. We also carried out some primary research for this project, and we talked to a number of operators and also users of spectrum. And the thing that came across to us when we did that is that there is a good understanding of the solutions that could be provided by 26 gigahertz. So it's not really a case that people don't know what to do with this. I think there's lots of ideas what to do with this, what innovation can be achieved with it. The the main concerns that people had were, one, particularly in Europe, about the availability of the 3GPP-N258 ecosystem and access to the spectrum to enable them to realize their use cases. And some key points from that research: it highlighted the need for the use of licensed spectrum. There is a quality of assurance issue that comes with licensed spectrum, and the improvement in service it potentially offers over unlicensed substitutes. As I mentioned, the equipment availability timelines are important. Transparency is required for that to deliver some certainty. There's a need for clear communication on the timeline for availability of 5G standalone solutions. This is particularly important for people wanting to operate private networks or in industrial settings. But just to note, of course, standalone refers to the core rather than a private network. And there's also been, in places where this has been deployed, there's also been good feedback on FWA trials and the throughput that can actually be achieved in hotspots, and also the distance range that can be achieved. So in that sense, the feedback on performance on 26 gigahertz so far has been pretty positive in Europe. So next slide, please. I won't go through these in detail, but here are 3 examples of use cases we looked at. One is a 26 gigahertz trial at Le Havre in the seaport, a PMSE wireless video production vendor who we looked at on studio quality cameras and doing a very dense video production. And thirdly, at a railway station, Rennes railway station in France. And it has to be said that RCEP and France in general has been particularly active on 26, along with Italy. So they are definitely 2 places to go and have a look at if you want to see real life trials. Next slide, please. So on the ecosystem, as I've said, there's a desire to productize the use cases. And I think Jeanette already said this, there's an expectation that operators will deploy 26 gigahertz once demand becomes apparent and spectrum is available. I've referred to the lack of awareness of developments around band N258. But I think one of the other things that came clearly across in our research is the lack of awareness around the possibility to use the top 1 gigahertz of the 26 gigahertz band with N257 equipment. And as of the date when our report was written and finalized, which was around the middle of May, there were around 30 devices which were able to access that top 1 gigahertz of the 26 band. There's examples of where band N257 has already been deployed. And I've already mentioned standalone and the release 16 features. These come a little bit later. We'll start to see them coming online over the next few months, but they are a bit of an issue in terms of early deployment for some of the enterprise and industrial solutions, but they will come. Next slide, please. So I'll skip over this fairly quickly, but the 2 things to take away from this slide is that while for millimeter wave solutions, there's fewer devices currently available, the number of devices is expected to grow significantly over the next 12 months. And the second takeaway, looking at all 5G devices across all bands, is that the general 5G ecosystem is growing quicker than the 4G ecosystem was at the same point in its life cycle. Next slide, please. So turning to spectrum awards, there's good progress on this. So the band is already available in Denmark, Germany, Greece, Finland, Italy, Russia, Slovenia, and the UK. All EU countries have consulted on this, and there's awards currently going on in places like Croatia and announced in Spain and also announced in North Macedonia, I believe, a little while ago. However, we are still going a little bit slower. than perhaps is desirable in terms of building the momentum that's required for the ecosystem and deployment. But I think the other thing that's coming out, and this is a challenge for spectrum managers, is that 26 gigahertz doesn't really fit that well, the model of sub-6 gigahertz spectrum awards. And it's clear that you've got different approaches being taken by spectrum managers in different areas, and there's not really a one-size-fits-all scenario for access to this spectrum. It has to be driven by things like the nature of industrialization in the country, how much localized access is likely to be required. There's a whole host of things that need to be considered. Next slide, please. So what are the key considerations for access? Well, the first one is there's got to be sufficient spectrum available to support mobile network operators and others who may privately want to offer service. And this has to be on the least onerous technical and price terms. There's more work is required in some places about the measures that are required to accommodate incumbent users of spectrum. There's also likely to be entry from industrial players and other players who want to innovate with new service capabilities. We have to think here about things like neutral hosts. A lot of this will be localized, so localization will be a key feature of any access or licensing regime that sits around this spectrum. And there are a lot of experiments and trials going on with 5G generally. And then one of the points we picked up in our primary research is not all of these appear to deliver a route that leads to market. So a trial may happen, but then at the end of the trial, there's not necessarily the spectrum available to take it into commercial service. So if trials are going to demonstrate worthwhile innovation, there has to be that route there so that they can go into service with something that's pretty close to what was trialed. Next slide, please. So very quickly running over these in the last minute or so. So recommendations for regulators. It is key that regulators monitor whether there is unmet demand on a regular basis for access to 26 gigahertz spectrum. Given the nature of the usage, it's not like you're just looking at, say, for example, 3 or 4 mobile network operators. You've got to be looking at a more consistent landscape. If there's no incumbents, why not release the spectrum? Provide the means to take it back if it's not used. If there are incumbents, look at what you need to do to accommodate them, but also, again, come back to the top 1 gigahertz or the 26 gigahertz band, where generally there's the least incumbency issues. Implement tax incentives or other subsidy or incentive arrangements to encourage people to deploy 26 gigahertz and bring the benefits forward. I think in terms of sort of flexibility, we've covered most of the points here around localized access, but do keep encouraging innovation on use cases and including 26 gigahertz in these to ensure that the focus remains on innovation here. And last slide, please. And if you're looking more at industry, I think just again, particularly from our research points that came out, promote the already wide availability of the N257 ecosystem as it provides a quick start route for working with 26 gigahertz. Improve transparency and the visibility of ecosystems for ecosystem developments for N258, and start setting some expectations for how quickly devices can come to market. Improve the visibility around 26 gigahertz standalone solutions, and give a lot more publicity to trials than perhaps there has been to encourage others to start to enter the market. So with that, I'll conclude my remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony. Very, very nice presentation and very nice messages. We can start also with some questions. We received a question for Jeanette, and this is coming from Simon Pike, who is an independent consultant. Actually, the question is, what assumptions did the studies make about the link budget at 26 gigahertz, and particularly non-line of sight propagation and the aperture gain of the antenna of the device?
Thank you, Luigi. Thank you, Simon. So the modelling that we did in this study was built upon a previous study that we also worked on with Qualcomm and with Ericsson. In the previous study, we were looking at rollout of 5G networks across Europe using 3 frequency bands, 700, 3.5, 26, but also using existing frequency bands that mobile operators have already, 2.1, 1800, etc. So in that study, we made some assumptions about the cell range in order to make some assumptions about investment costs. So if you were adding in 3.5 gigahertz cells or 700, then we made some assumptions about what the cell radius would be. For 26 gigahertz, however, we did not use a sort of bottom-up link budget calculation. So what we assumed, I think as I described on the slide, was that there would be different types of deployments. You would either be deploying 26 gigahertz radio onto macro sites, in which case your range would be slightly greater, or you would be using a different form factor, which might be a dedicated or a smaller cell, in which case it would typically be a lower power and a more focused range. What we found from the operators was that clearly taking fixed wireless access as a use case, the type of device is important. So to your question about non-line of sight range, etc., using a fixed CPE obviously is optimum in order to improve the range in that scenario. In the other use cases, obviously the link budget is quite specific to the device itself. So you could actually have different types of deployment and different ranges depending on what the capability of the actual device is, ranging from sort of something with an external antenna through to a sort of, direct to a smartphone kind of thing. So the sort of in summary, we did not make bottom-up calculations of the link budget, but what we did assume was just for each installation, there would be a certain number of sites needed based on the size of the area. And obviously there's a huge range here, but just taking a typical factory or a large factory or a port, we simply calculated number of sites in order to calculate our costs. So we looked at the typical size of a European port and then the typical range of a small cell versus a macro cell, and then we calculated the costs based on that. So apologies, that's not a complete answer, but that's how we modelled.
Thank you, Jeanette. And I have a question actually for both you and Tony, and this is actually on the tax incentives for the millimeter wave market. If we look at the information that are coming from Japan and the millimeter wave network deployment in Japan, we are seeing that actually all the 4 Japanese mobile network operators are expanding the millimeter wave G-Node-B coverage, and actually 43% of the total base station 5G deployed as of March 2021 are actually millimeter wave, whereas 57% are sub 6 gigahertz. And actually there is, we can notice 1 to 1.5 years they are ahead, all the carriers from the initial plan they made. So the question really is it the tax incentives that are making the Japanese carrier to deploy so fast millimeter wave in Japan? And what could be done, or could this be a measure in Europe? And why, or can you explain the different approach between Japanese carriers and European carriers in deploying millimeter wave?
Okay,
Tony, do you want to start? Yeah.
I know that you both spoke to Japanese carriers for your research, so you might have more insights, into what is the situation over there.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think a good starting point for this is to say how fast an operator rolls out and what incentives they have to roll out are driven by a number of things. Now, to roll out, the one thing you do need is CapEx. So anything you can do that either alleviates the capex or the OPEX requirements that come from the capex, so depreciation carried through onto profit and loss accounts and so on, that gives operators an incentive to roll out faster. It simply means they can use their money differently. I think the second aspect of this is you have to see the tax incentives in sort of the whole picture of how one encourages network rollout. And of course, in some places, Japan being one of them, Korea being another, there is a broader industrial emphasis on rolling out networks. We're also seeing it in Taiwan. So, for example, if you look in our report when it's published, you'll see some incentives which are in operation in Taiwan to improve or increase rollout as well. So I think it's the sort of totality of the picture that helps. In terms of then comparing it to, say, how network operators are in Europe, while there are some incentives of this sort, I don't think we've seen them used on such a wide basis. And the approach in Europe tends to be more subsidy driven in the event of market failure. So it's more geared towards where there's not an economic case for investment, putting in place some mechanisms that allow that to take place. So, for example, the single rural network in the UK is a good example of that, where economically it doesn't make sense to an operator to roll out. However, generally in Europe, where it is commercially viable for, or at least from a regulatory perspective, it's commercially viable from an operator to roll out, we tend not to see so many other incentives that are actually encouraging that rollout. We tend to be in more of a target and subsidy driven structure. So I think that does make a difference. Now, in some European countries, we have sort of seen offsets on depreciation schedules for mobile operators and so on in various years, but I'm not sure we've ever tackled this on a formal basis across the sort of EU 27 in perhaps the way a unified country like Japan can tackle it. So sorry, that's a long answer to your question, but Jeanette?
Yes, Tony, I agree with that, and I was just checking what we've what we found from our report as well. And so, I mean, I agree with you broadly that in Europe the approaches to encouraging rollout have generally been based on targets rather than subsidies, and also quite often where there is subsidy, it relates to a specific objective such as rural connectivity, extending beyond the commercial footprint. Just in terms of the Japanese market in particular, and what we found when we spoke to players during the primary research, obviously in Japan, there has been very strong growth across both the mobile and the fixed markets, and that has been supported, as Tony's just said, by rapid development in digital technologies, industrialization, and internet connectivity and everything. So that is one point, is the rapid growth in data and the expectation of the Japanese market having very high quality mobile networks, and so obviously there is a strong capacity requirement.
Okay, looks like we lost Jeanette, probably.
Yeah, she's frozen, I think.
Okay, I think maybe we had another question. In the meantime, we can wait for Jeanette to come back. It is a question from Samsung, and this is any study regarding unnecessary noise by SATCOM operators on use of 26 gigahertz for IMT and active antenna systems?
Not something I've personally looked into, Luigi. I think generally the emphasis has been the other way round, hasn't it, in terms of looking to protect things like the passive sensors on the EESS, and looking to make sure there's the scope for meeting increased demand for FSS in certain parts of the band. But I've personally not come across any issues on IMT active antenna arrays, if I'm reading the question correctly.
Okay, good. I guess we are at the end also of our session. I mean, it's just a couple of minutes to go. So I believe that we can close it, as we have no more questions. And I'd like to thank you, Tony. Also, I'd like to thank Jeanette, although she's not here, for the very, very interesting session. And I guess our audience could go and log in onto your website and Analysis Mason website to get a download of the full reports on millimeter wave. So with this, I'd like to close, and thank you to everybody for your attention.